Japan up close.
Sure. I think Japan, speaking as a Singaporean and from within Southeast Asia, is a very interesting international partner for many countries in this region. There's obviously a long history, some of it positive, some of it not so positive. But I think that the role Japan plays in today's world is quite a critical one, especially from the point of view of Southeast Asia, organizations like ASEAN. And I think that the world is becoming an increasingly complex, complicated, contested space. If we talk about this particular region, there's geopolitical securities, there's maritime territorial issues in the South China Sea. There is a major power rivalry between the US and China. And of course, a broader range of security issues sparked by considerations, with issues of a war in Ukraine, for example, and other issues that could potentially raise concerns like Taiwan. So Japan as a country that is an economic power, that is a cultural power, and as an organization that has very deep roots in Asia, in Southeast Asia as well, has a very significant role to play. And I think, from the longer term perspective, all of us in Southeast Asia would be very interested to see Japan continue to be invested, involved, and interested in this region, and to play a benevolent role. In what sort of context, in what sort of sphere? It is definitely a multidimensional involvement, economically, financially, technology, from a technological perspective, from the notion of smart cities, sustainability in the environment. And interestingly, with the recent announcements around Japan's defense policy, potentially even militarily as well, within, of course, the confines of the Japanese constitution. So as we see more and more contestation in different spheres, competition in different areas, the sort of ASEAN way to build partnerships, to build relationships with as many different partners and stakeholders as possible, we'll see a country like Japan continue to play a very significant role. And of course, in all the different areas, there would be different considerations as well. And maybe we could talk a bit more about some of those a bit later on.
Since 1980s, Japan has been a kind of a locomotive of regional economy in Southeast Asia and regional kind of integrations through the industrialization, the supply chains development, and so on. Because after the Plaza Accord in the mid-1980s, the Japanese yen really appreciated. So in order to reduce the production costs, a lot of Japanese multinational companies moved to Asia, including Southeast Asia. So since then, Japan has been a kind of the hub of these kind of regional production networks, right? Of course, over the past 10 years, we could see emerging China, also kind of influential economic power in the region, but not necessarily kind of surpass Japan. It's still, to some degree, the Japanese and the Chinese economy and economic role in the region complement each other to some extent, not necessarily kind of out competitions between these two economic powers. So that is the economic role of Japan in Southeast Asia, and continue to play this kind of technological innovation, the flow of foreign direct investment, trade, and also kind of the capacity building of the small medium enterprises across the region, because Japan economy have been centering on SME. About 80% of Japanese economy, contributed by small medium enterprises. So the experience of Japan in terms of economic development, especially the role of SME, can be kind of a source of inspiration, lesson learned for many Southeast Asian countries, which we are really focused on SME development. When it comes to peace and security issues, of course, Japan has been constrained by its peaceful constitutions. So in terms of security role, not so much across the region. Most of the policy of Japan is pretty much in line with those of the United States. When it comes to security policy, the alliance system with the US remains the cornerstone of Japan defense policy. Anyway, Japan also trying to be independent to some extent when it comes to strategic and defense and security policy, such as the Japan kind of version of free and Indo-Pacific, the proactive contribution to peace idea of the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, for instance. It's quite different from the U.S. doctrine, security doctrine, because Japan's still Asian country, so it have an Asian kind of way of communication, kind of Asian thinking, concept, philosophy in its defense policy. Anyway, we don't see Japan as a threat when it comes to security issue. Japan is a kind of a benign power of the role of Japan between the middle power and the superpower, so somewhere between that. So it's very difficult to define security role and identity of Japan in this context. But anyway, with a kind of a revised defense strategy of Japan, it will be more active in a way, but Japan very strict to what we call non-military kind of cooperations. So mainly on soft approach of security, so to speak, on capacity building, those issues related to non-traditional security issues such as humanitarian relief, disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, those kind of things, peacekeeping operations. So those kind of the soft approach of a kind of a security dimension of Japan engagement in Southeast Asia. So in other words, I think human security, the Japanese kind of priority is human security, remain the priority of Japan defense diplomacy.
I think the notion of alignment with US priorities, but at the same time, a slightly more independent or autonomous approach to diplomacy will be quite critical for Japan. As we know, consistently, the one thing that ASEAN and ASEAN nations would like to avoid is being forced to choose between a major power, major power rivals in this region. So if Japan is able to offer, a certain, we all know in terms of its alignment, it's definitely a little bit closer to the US, but it can offer an independent approach. It will make it much easier for relationships to be built and sustained now and into the future. Especially in the areas that Vannarith has shared in terms of maybe non-traditional security, on areas such as cyber defense, which is a key priority for the Japanese security strategy as well. And these are things that not just Singapore but many countries in this region will be quite interested in as well. So having that slightly more independent approach, I think would make it quite easy, a bit more easy for Japan to integrate and to interface with the international community in this region.
Well, we look at the number of a kind of scholarship that the Japanese government provided to Southeast Asian students. And in the 1990s, I think most of Southeast Asian countries look to Japan as a source of technology, knowledge, So I think most of students in Southeast Asia, I think Japan is the most attractive destination for their educations. And Malaysia in particular, Mahathir have its kind of look east policy, which he sent a lot of Malaysian students to Japan for higher education, skills and technology. Not only Malaysia, but Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia. later wave is Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar. So this is very important because back in the 1990s we have this kind of a concept of flying cheese model. Japan is flying ahead of others and others just follow Japan. So kind of technology transfer, knowledge transfer from Japan to the newly industrialized economies in Asia, right? So this is the human development that Japan has contributed to Southeast Asia. Even until now, I think Japan remains one of the destination for Southeast Asian students. Now Japan is really in need of skilled and semi-skilled migrant workers to Japan due to aging societies. So a lot of Southeast Asian now, I think, kind of have moved to Japan to find their job and opportunities, especially those students who graduate from in Japan at the Japanese universities. So I think down the road, we would see more this kind of educational exchange. And Japan have this kind of what we call it innovation diplomacy, or science technology innovation diplomacy, STI diplomacy, that other dialogue partner of ASEAN may not have STI diplomacy. So I think if Japan can better utilize this STI diplomacy to attract talents than to promote these people to people ties through education, then I would be one of the key link between Japan and Southeast Asia. From my perspective, Japan play a critical role in bridging the gap, promoting strategic trust. Sometimes Japan play a bridging role between the US and its allies with the East, with the other Asian countries. So that is very important. So having Japan in the meeting room, we can feel a more sense of reconciliations in terms of tones and so on. And behind the scenes, Japan have worked a lot behind the scenes to encourage people to reach certain agreement or to compromise on certain issues. So that is political diplomatic role of Japan in these multilateral meetings and summits and so on. And of course, Japan is also very keen in economic integration and connectivity, and especially in trade. I think we need to give Japan a big applause when it comes to trade liberalizations, from the CPTPP to RCEP and other regional integration projects. Japan have been very proactive and really deliver, on this front, trade liberalization, facilitation, regional integration and connectivity. Another role of Japan is this kind of create a synergies of competing regional initiatives, because Japan initiative, including the free and open Indo-Pacific, is quite neutral in a way that we can relate to. ASEAN Master Plan on Connectivity and ASEAN Initiative can relate to Japan FOIP. And China, the Belt and Road Initiative, also can relate to that FOIP as well, because the key principles and the philosophy behind it and the practical area cooperation are not so much different. A lot of commonalities between ASEAN and Japan with others. And in the Mekong region in particular, because if you look at the Mekong region, it's kind of a very dynamic region, because a lot of partners, development partners, are all involved in these regions. And Japan is also trying to play a bridging role, especially between the US and China, by creating platform for coordination and dialogue and so on. So although Japan and China is in competition, but Japan is not the US. Competition in a way that will not harm common area of operations. So that is the difference between Japan and the US when it comes to regional multilateral systems.
Potentially, that might become even more complex given Japan's sort of reframed security strategy. We saw the Chinese reaction when Japan sort of explained or justified its interest to develop counter-strike capabilities. For example, the Chinese took it very personally, and they felt that Japan was making certain claims about the Chinese threat as a reason for it to want to beef up and increase its defense budget spending and also its capabilities in terms of counter-strike. Yeah, that's the way the Japan strategy positions it. But I do agree with Dr. Chheang in the sense that Japan has a very critical role to play. I think interestingly, if we look ahead to 2023, Japan will be the chair of the G7 summits, and that will be a key opportunity for it to continue playing a bridging role and a leadership role in terms of developing better relations, between regions and between countries. And I think one thing that a lot of observers have pointed out over time is that Japan's ties to Europe is quite significant, given the European interest to start playing a significant role in the Indo-Pacific as well. So it'll be interesting to see how those relationships can be shepherded by a country like Japan, which is viewed potentially, not on the polar extreme. Again, like what Dr. Chheang was saying, it's not US, even though it is aligned on some areas with the US, and it can definitely play an influential role without necessarily raising the same kind of reactions customarily that you would see if a major power, US or China, was involved in that sense. So I think now and definitely into the future, Japan has a major role to play in sort of multilateral fora and also in bilateral relations or trilateral or relationships where it can play a certain role. Its involvement with the Quad, for example, is also quite important. And I look forward to seeing how Japan can continue to play such a positive role in these international relations. Well, I think the ASEAN region, obviously I'm conflicted and have a conflict of interest because, I sit in Southeast Asia, but, I think Southeast Asia and a grouping like ASEAN is a significant player in the region. For smaller countries such as the member nations of ASEAN, the notion of joining a bloc like ASEAN is quite critical, right? It's sort of the only game in town in terms of joining forces with a platform that can give you a voice that will be relevant and recognized on the international stage. If individual ASEAN countries stood alone, there's a high chance that there wouldn't necessarily be much chance for its voice to be heard in that sense. Economically, we've touched on it a little bit. If you look at ASEAN as a grouping, it potentially will be the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world before too much time has passed. And we're looking at a population of 660 million, which is not insignificant if you consider the relative size of the individual countries. So I can see why a country like Japan and its leaders would want to come to this particular region to engage. Vannarith has already shared in the beginning why Japan was looking, to this region in terms of outsourcing some of its manufacturing requirements, for example, and vice versa, why many young people and other citizens of this region will look to Japan as a place to learn and develop new skills and capabilities as well. So I think that relationship would probably be the reason why Japanese leaders would be interested in this particular region. If I were to give a specific example, I met up with Secretariat staff of the Japanese cabinet last week who are actually visiting Singapore and Thailand. And their interest was quite specific. It was on the potential terrorism threat in this region, and also the efforts by countries like Singapore and Thailand in terms of countering radicalization of individuals in our respective countries. And I was quite interested, and I said, I don't think Japan necessarily has a similar problem that maybe countries in this part of the world would face in terms of influence of Islamic extremism, for example. And they said, oh, that's not necessarily true because we also have migrant populations in Japan, of workers, of citizens from other countries who could be prone to either becoming radicalized, and the threat of radicalization is now being spread online in the digital realm, so it can reach anywhere in the world. And they are also concerned that potentially there could be import of extremist ideology by these people who are resident in Japan. So they were very keen to learn some of the specific areas and the work that's been done by countries like Singapore, which is dealing with this threat on a consistent basis as well. So, while there's great desire for many people in this particular region to learn from Japan in technology, in science, in industry development, reciprocally, there's also this interest for Japan to learn from certain aspects of how other countries in this region deal with different issues. Terrorism, radicalization is just one example. So, it's not a surprise to see political leaders from Japan seeking to come to engage in this region, to establish their ties and their relationships, early on in their careers in government, for example. I think potentially one of the issues that people in Singapore would look at when they consider Japan is, of course, the political changes and the speed and the rate at which we see changes in government in Japan. It's not something that we in Singapore are very used to, and I think that quite consistently, Singapore and other Southeast Asian nations would usually want to be the first to engage with new administrations in Japan as soon as it's possible as well. So I think we're quite grateful that we are quite high on the list of priorities when it comes to Japanese political leaders looking to make their first visits, and the fact that they choose countries in this region to be among the first ones that they engage with. So hopefully that continues in the future.
I just would like to add, it's quite interesting when it comes to radical kind of extremism and terrorism. We always think Japan is the safe country, free, kind of to some extent free from this threat. But I think as Japan is opening up now to migrant workers, especially from Southeast Asia, I think they start to have more concern with this extremism and terrorism. So that is quite interesting, that how can Southeast Asia have Japan to prevent this kind of terrorist attacks on the Japanese soil, for instance. Never know, because in the future. So that is quite interesting. I just would like to add that I think the future of Japan will be more connected with Asia than Europe and America. Economy and defense and security. Because to some extent, the West is in relative decline in terms of economic and strategic influence. Look at the domestic political mess in the US and some European countries, the rising political, kind of movements and so on. I'm quite, how to say, pessimistic about the future of the West to some extent. So the future of Japan will be more connected with Asia. So that is for sure. And Southeast Asia is the most dynamic and neutral crown for Japan, because we try to be neutral in a way. We don't take sides, and open space, open and safe space for everyone to get involved, economically, politically, and security, and so on. So that is the fertile ground for Japan for its own survival and for the future of Japan. So ranging from economy to security, people to people, migrants, migration, labor market, and so on. So Southeast Asia have much to offer to Japan and to the world. And I'm very optimistic about Southeast Asia in a way. Although we have some differences between some of the key members of ASEAN, but I think at the end of the day, we understand that we need to be united and work together to address our common challenges and make our region remain one of the most dynamic and promising regions in the world.
Yeah, so I think that's 100% a key factor in terms of Japan's sort of power projection around the world. Not in the sense of traditional military power or aggressive offensive military capabilities, but much more, as we have spoken about, in terms of humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, non-offensive roles that it has put as its priority. And I think that given the history and legacy, dating back to the Second World War, for example, I think that's a critical part in terms of how Japan can build this trust and can build this more positive relationship that it has done so well for so many decades in recent memory. I do think that the change in the national security strategy would be something that is worth keeping an eye on. I think how Japan goes about developing the capabilities that it has said that it wants to will play a big role in terms of how big powers like China will view Japan, and potentially partners in Southeast Asia would view Japan as well. Whether these capabilities depends on a network approach with other countries, whether we build capabilities that can be interfaced and can be linked in that sense, or networked with other capabilities in the region. That will be quite interesting to see. Japan has said that it will acquire more capabilities from overseas, from partners like the US, but also develop its own capabilities. So I think we are going to see how this new strategy plays out in the years ahead, and how it's sustained by the current administration and potentially the next administrations who would follow from that. So I think there will be some dependence on that. That being said, I think a lot of Japan's influence and branding throughout the world, in this part of the world, extends far beyond hard military capabilities or contributions to that sort of collaborative effort in the region. I think Japan is potentially the leading country in Asia in terms of soft power projection, in terms of its attractiveness of its culture. Most of my friends, it's December, it's the holiday season now, and almost everybody I know who is traveling now is in Japan. They're either skiing in Niseko, they're shopping in Tokyo, they're eating in Hokkaido, and everybody loves Japan, along with Korea, as a destination for culture, for food, for entertainment, and for recreation as well. And I think we cannot underplay how significant that is in terms of building goodwill, in terms of building relationships between people to people, the people to people sectors, and even between political leaders. A lot of Singaporean politicians I know are also in Japan, skiing or having a holiday now as well. So I think it cannot just be defined by its role that it has played in terms of disarmament, non-proliferation, or peace-building efforts. That's definitely important, but there's a lot of other aspects of it. I mean, if you think about the recent World Cup, we see a lot of admiration for the Japanese fans who were watching the Japanese team, who did very well. And after that, of course, famously, they're always cleaning up the stadiums, and they're always making sure that everything is neat and tidy. I think that garners a lot of admiration and respect for the Japanese people, but Japan as a country as well. The Singapore football team was, I think, 2 weeks ago, having a training camp in Chiba in Japan, and our national coach is Japanese as well. So I think in softer areas like culture, like sports, and tourism, Japan has had a lot to offer other countries in the region, and I think that trust, that respect, that admiration for Japan is built across a few different pillars, and not necessarily just maybe the harder aspects that we have been speaking about in this interview so far. So I think we can't underplay that. Japan is one of my favorite places to go to as well. So
I think Japan is becoming a normal country. The normal country, by which I mean you need a defense. Ministry of Defense of Japan just established not long ago. You can imagine a country, second largest, now third largest economy without a kind of Ministry of Defense and what we call military forces. They still call themselves a self-defense forces, not military forces. But anyway, looking at Japan defense capabilities, it becoming a normal country as a third largest world economy. You need to have this kind of credible, reliable defense forces. And this, looking from a positive side, it will have Japan to be more independent from the United States, because if you keep relying on the US for security protection, then it's very hard to be completely independent, you know. So that is one of the ways for Japan to be more independent from the US when it comes to defense and foreign policy too. So China should look from that angle as well, not so much on kind of the US-Japan alliance, or Japan is a proxy of the US all the time. But to some extent, Japan trying to be more independent as well. So looking from that angle, perhaps China would understand Japan in a more comprehensive way.
Sure. I think I have 2 points on relation to that. I think the first one, of course, is to, as I sort of said at the start, be very, very aware of the fact that most countries in Southeast Asia and ASEAN as a bloc would not want to be forced to choose. I think we quite commonly feel pressure now and in recent years to align either with the US or China. And the traditional position is that ASEAN is neutral. ASEAN is central to its members' concerns, and we will want to operate with an ASEAN focus and not to align with any particular side. And in Singapore's position, you know, the traditional view of the Singapore government is that we are not pro anything. We're not pro-US, we're not pro-China, we're pro-Singapore. And I think that recognizing that this desire for neutrality and centrality of the member states of ASEAN is a good starting point for a country like Japan to always keep in mind when it engages. As Japan rises and continues to rise, I think that appreciation and awareness will be quite critical. The second thing that I think is worth bearing in mind as Japan seeks to maintain its position of trust, of admiration, of respect, is that when we talk about ASEAN, and we've talked about ASEAN very much in this interview, almost referencing it to be a homogeneous, entirely uniform and united bloc. And it's quite important to recognize that ASEAN really isn't an EU, for example. Most of the member states in ASEAN don't even share a land border, and the levels of development of economic growth of capabilities is very, very different across all the different member states. And you have bigger countries like in Indonesia. You have tiny countries like the Laos, Myanmar, and potentially Timor-Leste as when it joins the ASEAN grouping. It has more modernized countries and it has developing countries. So when we talk about the ASEAN bloc as a whole, it's quite important to know that the member states have different considerations, they have different priorities, they have different experiences, and they have different capabilities, economic, militarily, and so on and so forth. So to then think about ASEAN as one unified bloc is probably a mistake. And to think that every member state of ASEAN would think in the same way and react in the same way is also potentially quite different. And I think Japan is fully aware of this. It has been a player and operator in this region for a long time. And it will also be very aware of the fact that ASEAN, operates from a point of view of non-interference in the affairs of all its individual member states, domestic affairs. It's non-confrontational. And there is the ASEAN way, which is operating on the basis of 100% agreement before anything can be passed in terms of decisions, joint statements, communiques, and things like that. And it's that particular peculiarity or characteristic of ASEAN that has also exposed, for example, the ability for a country like China to exert some influence within the bloc, because they don't need to have all 10 member states to agree with one particular view. They just need one member state to be able to influence the entire decision-making process of the bloc as well. So if Japan wants to continue building on its position of trust, its attractiveness in Southeast Asia, I think those are the two things that it has to constantly bear in mind and remember. Again, I'm sure the leaders in Japan are fully aware of this, given their long experience in the region, but it's something that has to be, I don't think it's going to change anytime soon.
Yeah, I share the view with Nicholas with regards to the trust that Japan has earned, and Japan need to maintain this trust. According to the perception survey of Southeast Asian elites from academics, think tanks, private sector governments, over the past several years, Japan has been always the top, the most reliable partner of Southeast Asia. So that is the reflection of reality, actually. That perception is a reflection of reality that Southeast Asian elites trust Japan the most, because first, Japan has been a very benign power, and Japan always deliver what it promised, it pledge, it deliver. And when we are in trouble or crisis, Japan always one of the first to come to help us. For instance, the Asian financial crisis back in 1997, Japan, China, and Korea come together to help a Southeast Asian economy. That's why we still have a Chiang Mai initiative, even until now, the ASEAN +3 framework, for instance. A third point is consistency. Japan have been very consistent on certain principles, such as international law, for instance. So Japan have been very consistent on promoting rule-based international order, and Japan have been very consistent in this building kind of regional cooperation and integration for all, not to exclude anyone from this regional integration and cooperations. So that consistencies help Japan to build trust and maintain trust. Last point here from the trust position is try to be as independent as possible from the United States, because, as I said, we are not interested in taking sides. But I believe that Japan is trying to do so as an independent actor, especially when it comes to security and defense. So that would be a welcome for Southeast Asian countries. No one wants to become proxy of any superpower. And Japan can be a kind of a key player for Southeast Asia to hedge against US and China in terms of competition. So Japan provide a space for Southeast Asia to hedge between US and China. So that is very important role. India too also have that role, that Southeast Asia need this kind of middle power or kind of significant power in the region, so that we can promote a strategic equilibrium. The more actors that we can involve, the better space we can expand for our survival and growth.
Japan up close.